Shavua Tov, there's a beautiful Yiddish saying, a Mensch tracht und Gott lacht. Man plans and God laughs. Well, in this week's Parsha, there's a man named Pharaoh, and he plans that this nation that is living in the underbelly of Egypt and is becoming multiplus, very many of them, and he's afraid of them. So what does he do? I'm going to enslave them and oppress them in order that they won't be so many, that they will stop having kids like that. And what happens? The Torah says, the more they would oppress them, the more they would become multiplus. So a Mensch tracht and Gott lacht, the opposite result happens. Then he's told by his magicians that a savior has been born or is about to be born to the Israelites. And so Pharaoh is very afraid of that. And so he says, throw all of the boys into the river. And what happens? Because he says that rule, throw all the boys into the river, one boy gets put in a basket on the river, and that boy happens to be the one who's going to be the savior of Israel. And where does he end up growing up? In Pharaoh's own house. A Mensch tracht und Gott lacht. But we need to understand, first of all, what was it that Egypt was out for? Why did they enslave the Bnei Yisrael? And what's even more, the aftermath. How do we judge Egypt? The Torah says one should not despise an Egyptian because you were a guest in his land. Wow. But who are we supposed to not accept into our congregation until eternity? The sons of Ammon and Moab. These were two nations in the eastern part of the Jordan Valley. And the question is, what did they do that was so bad? Well, they didn't bring you water and bread when you were exiting Egypt and passing by them. And they hired Bilam to curse you. Okay, so for that, they can never be accepted in the Jewish people. But the Egyptians, who enslaved us for nearly a century, beat us, threw and murdered the boys, threw them in the river, them, don't despise them because you were a guest in their land. This is a little bit upside down, don't you think? Because Ammon and Moab, okay, they didn't bring us bread and water. They didn't bring out catering, okay? Wow. Terrible, right? Well, on the surface, I mean, it's not nice, but I mean, how does it compare to throwing baby boys into the river, goodness sake? And then they hired Bilam to curse us. And Bilam didn't even end up cursing us. He ended up blessing us with such beautiful phrases that we've incorporated them into our prayer services. So how come they get the ultimate insult, never can join the Jewish people, and the Egyptians, who enslaved us and oppressed us and were horribly cruel for nearly a century, they were not supposed to despise, they're okay? How does that work exactly? Well, one could say that there is a lesson in gratitude, because in truth, before we were enslaved by Egypt, Egypt treated us very well. We were honored guests. We were given the best land in the land, the best territory for flocks, for our economic needs to live in, the nice part of town, if you will. We recall last week's Parsha when Jacob was buried, the great honor that the Egyptians gave to Jacob. So they were great for us, to us, for a long time. Then they turned sour. But the important lesson, I guess, would be, don't judge the entirety of a nation, or a person for that matter, on mistakes and bad things that they do if they had a lot of good things that happened too. So there may be a lesson in that as well. Not to write off Egypt, because Egypt had a lot of good qualities and they went through a bad period, but they also had some great times. That could be one explanation. But I think that even in the enslavement of the Bnei Yisrael, there is a bright spot when we understand why they did it. Now, why did Pharaoh do it? What does he see? He sees, he says, let us be wise, lest they continue to multiply, and there is a war, and they will join against us, and then they will leave the land. So he seems to be ultimately afraid that the Bnei Israel are going to leave Egypt. That's a strange thing. If he hates the Israelites, then he should want them to leave. As a matter of fact, why doesn't he, instead of enslaving them, just say, hey guys, it's been fun, get lost? Do that. That makes sense. If you really hate them, kick them out. If you don't want them in your neighborhood, so then don't let them in your neighborhood. Why is he afraid they're going to leave? So there's some who say that the last phrase of that verse about they will leave the land is not referring to the Israelites at all. It's referring to the Egyptians. In other words, he envisions that the Israelites, because there are so many of them living in the underbelly of Egypt, that they would join perhaps with the Hittite Empire if they attack Egypt from the north, and then they will kick the Egyptians out. So in other words, who's going to leave the land? The Egyptians, not the Bnei Israel. That the Bnei Israel, they're going to take over the whole business. That's one possible explanation. It doesn't really fit in with the flow of the verse, but okay. Another explanation is that he's indeed afraid that the Israelites will leave, not so much for him, but because he knows that when they go to the land of Canaan, they're going to wipe out the Canaanites, and the Canaanites are his allies. And so he doesn't want to have that international incident on his record. That's a possible explanation, but it's, I don't know, I'm not sure that it's strong enough. But there is a great commentator, the Or HaChaim HaKadosh, who gives us a new understanding of this. And the first thing he says is, what did Pharaoh see when he looked at the Bnei Israel, the Israelites? He saw a nation that is different from the Egyptians, and that's not supposed to be. They've been in this country, said Pharaoh, for more than a century. They should look and sound and be Egyptian by now. They should assimilate. They should be together. Unity. Let's all be together. One nation. And yet they insist on keeping their language, their garments, their names, and so forth and so on. And the phrase that he says about them is, Hinei am b'nei Yisrael. When he says to his people, he says, behold, the nation of the children of Israel. In other words, what he's saying is, look, they are still clearly different. They are the nation of the children of Israel. They haven't become Egyptians, and that bugs him. So the Or HaChaim goes on to explain, he doesn't want them to leave. He doesn't hate them. And that's the difference between Egypt and Ammon and Moab. He doesn't hate them. He's disappointed in them, and he's afraid of them. Whereas Ammon and Moab, they were not afraid of the Jewish people. They may have been, but they hated the Jewish people. In other words, Pharaoh's actions can be explained by self-preservation. But Ammon and Moab, it's pure hatred. If you see people who are hungry and thirsty and straggling along the way, you go out and you help them. You bring them bread, you bring them water. To not do that, that's cruelty. To hire a guy to curse them, that's hatred. Hatred has no place in the tents of Jacob, and therefore even 10 generations, forever, they may never become Ammonim and Moabim in the Jewish people. But the Egyptians, they didn't hate us. They weren't anti-Semites. You know, it's remarkable that throughout the whole stories of these parshas, we see that the Bnei Israel come to Pharaoh, they can complain, they can talk to him. Could you imagine something like that during World War II? Do you think anybody a Jewish person could have gone in to see the leader of Germany to complain? Forget it. But in Egypt, it happened. So Pharaoh did not hate them. He feared them. And he really wanted them to become Egyptians because he had a worldview about that. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But he wanted to get rid of the boys. Why, says the Or HaChaim? The same exact reason. If there are no boys around, then who are the Jewish girls gonna marry? Egyptian guys, right? And then, finally, they will assimilate. They'll become Egyptians. There still is this idea that all of humanity should give up their national identities or their ethnic identities and just be one entity. I can't think of a better word to use. I remember reading a book by H.G. Wells, written after World War I. He was an author with a bit of an anti-Semitic attitude too. And he writes about a book called The History of the World or something like that. And he talks about this exact thing. He says, now after World War I, don't we see what the dangers of all of these nations are, that they're going to fight and they're going to be wars? We should eliminate nations. We should all be one thing. And he goes on to say, and specifically the Jews are looking to create their own ethnic national identity. How wrong and how terrible that is. They're causing such trouble for the whole world. Right? That's anti-Semitism. But one could say that this was what Pharaoh was thinking too. Pharaoh was thinking they should assimilate. Based on the Or HaChaim, that Pharaoh was upset by the fact that the Israelites remained distinct. They should assimilate. Let's all be one people. But the Israelites weren't playing that game. And why not? Where did they find that strength? The answer is Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Because the Israelites had a unique character, which they had from the time when Judah stood before his father and said, I will be a guarantor. Anochi erevenu, I am responsible for him. At that moment, the Jews became responsible for each other. The Israelites became responsible for each other. And the Israelites in Egypt, whether their behavior was ethical or not, they had become also infected by paganism and idolatry. but they never gave up their identity because they knew that they were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they felt a responsibility to keep the mission of that people, of those three founders of them, alive and into the future. And they never gave up the hope that they would someday return to their land and fulfill those dreams, that faith, that connection. When God speaks to Moses at the burning bush, he says, I think 5 times he mentions, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because that resonates in the Israelite soul. And for this reason, for that sense of responsibility about being part of the Jewish people, they never would allow themselves to assimilate. Now, there have been cases where Jews have assimilated and have even changed their religion, and that is usually when the person has gotten rid of their sense of responsibility toward the Jewish people and feels more of a sense of responsibility to their own success. For example, you have the famous composer in Germany who was the grandson of Moses Mendelssohn, Felix Mendelssohn, who felt that he simply couldn't proceed in his career unless he became Christian, so he converted away. But that's the exception, that is not the rule. The rule is that a Jew, even if they have become lax in their observance of the commandments, their Jewish identity is still in them. They still feel a connection to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and that's why God said it to Moses 5 times, and that is what kept the Jewish people from assimilating. They never changed their names and their language and their mode of clothing. They never changed their identity. Their behavior may have lapsed, but their identity was never touched. And so therefore in the war, to bring people back and close to Torah, to bring them back to a Jewish life, the first arrow in the quiver has to be the arrow of Jewish identity, simply to take somebody like they do on Birthright and other wonderful programs who may not know what it means to be a member of the Jewish people and strengthen that, and then wonders and amazing things can follow. Shavua Tov.